Good morning, everyone. Hope you had a great learning experience yesterday. So we are back with again informative sessions. So for those who are joining just now, the links to the recordings of the previous sessions will be posted in Discord and Hype. So you can go through it. And if you have any doubts, feel free to contact us. So just before we get started, I'd like to remind you that participants can ask any questions. You can raise any questions by posting it in chat box at any point of the session. Without any further ado, let me introduce you to the speaker of the day, Ms. Guncha Malik ma'am. Welcome ma'am. So Guncha Malik ma'am is a security compliance architect at IBM with 21 plus experience of extensive IT industry experience. So, in the last 10 years, she has played multiple roles in data security and compliance and has worked on threat modeling, security testing, incident response, continuous monitoring, and SOC2 audits. So, she is also a Qiskit advocate by passion and has been actively involved in the Qiskit community from 2020. She also believed in the importance of spreading cyber safety awareness within the community and has been an active volunteer at iamcybersafe.org. Personally, she enjoys art and has a keen liking towards street art around the world. So, ma'am, we request you to take over.
Thank you, Ms. Nanna. Can you please confirm if you're able to see my screen?
Yes, ma'am, your screen is visible.
Thank you so much. All right. So thank you everyone for joining. I know it's Sunday and you're all getting up for your hackathon as well. So first of all the best for your hackathon. And today we are just going to cover a topic on the quantum safe cryptography. This session will be divided into two parts. In the first section, we are just going to look at the different quantum risks and the work that is being undertaken to address those. And in the second part, we will look at Shor's algorithm. Of course, not in much detail because it is a short time that we have, but we will go through Shor's algorithm and try to understand how the factorization can be done. And we'll take a look at some hands-on to implement Shor's algorithm using Qiskit. At any point, if you do have questions, please feel free to post your questions on chat. Either Dr. Manjula or I will address those. And if we are not able to take those questions within this session, we'll come to it later. All right, so let's start taking a look at what is quantum safe cryptography. Now, we'll start from the basics for those who are not much aware of the encryption at all. So you must have heard about the terms symmetric and asymmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption is where we have the same key that is used for encrypting the data and decrypting the data. So take a case where someone wants to send an information over the public channel. If it is sent in plain text, of course, anyone on the public channel can take a look at it. If the data has to be protected from any eavesdropper, we would need to encrypt that and send it across. But there needs to be a mechanism for the other person to open it up and read it. So take the case of Alice and Bob here. Alice wants to send a message to Bob over a public channel. So Alice takes the information, uses the symmetric encryption key to encrypt that data and send it across to Bob. Now, Bob needs to have the same key in order to decrypt the message and read it. Now, if an eavesdropper, Eve, needs to or wants to take a look at that data, since it is encrypted, he would not be able to take a look at it. But if Eve gets hold on the symmetric key itself, Eve would be able to decrypt this data and take a look at it. Now, the tricky part here would be really for Alice to share the symmetric key with Bob, or rather, Bob to share the symmetric key with Alice, such that it is not available for with others. So they could use mechanism of personally meeting, physically exchanging the keys, or any other channel via which only the keys remain with Alice and Bob rather than anyone else. We'll come to the part where I've mentioned here that symmetric key encryption is faster than asymmetric key encryption, but we'll come to that a bit later. But these keys need to be stored securely No one else should have access to it, because anyone who has access to it can obviously decrypt the data very easily. Examples that are examples of the symmetric key encryption are AES, 3DES. DES and RC4 are not used anymore, not considered safe at all. But you will see the usage of symmetric encryption in the banking sector. Any data that is kept on rest, all that is done using symmetric encryption. Now, if we talk about asymmetric encryption, this is where we have two different keys. Now there's a key that we make publicly available for everyone to use, that is called the public key. And then there's a corresponding private key which is generated from the same set of numbers. This key will be kept with the person who needs to read the message. So if Bob wants to read a message that is only decrypted by Bob, Bob is going to share a public key which others can use to encrypt the data, and he will keep a private key with himself which only he can use for decrypting that data. Now this public key can be shared over public channel, can be available with anyone. This cannot be used to decrypt, so it is not such really a concern if it is shared over public channel. So let's take this case now. Alice wants to send a message to Bob. Alice is going to use Bob's public key, not just any public key, but the Bob's public key, in order to encrypt that data. Now, when Bob's receive this message, Bob is going to use his private key to decrypt the data, and Eve would need to really have access or steal the private key of Bob in order to decrypt the data, else Eve will not be able to understand what the message is. Now, these private keys again need to be kept securely, but the public key can be made available to everyone. Examples are Diffie-Hellman, ACC, RSA, which are quite often used. It is generally used in digital signatures and also for creating the initial session key. In case I'm going a little fast, please do let me know. I'll slow down a bit. Just let me know, okay? All right. So now, if we take a look at the key length of symmetric keys and asymmetric keys, generally symmetric keys have the key length of 128. For example, if we take of AES, AES is available in 128, 192, and 256 bits. But in order to provide an equivalent security, asymmetric keys need to be of the length of 1024, 2048, 4096. So you can look at the difference in the key lengths of these two different keys, symmetric keys and asymmetric keys, and that itself will tell you why symmetric keys are generally faster, because they have to really deal with smaller set of bits as compared to asymmetric algorithms. Because of this, you would see that symmetric key encryption is more often preferred in terms of performance. The only challenge is the distribution of the keys, and hence there is a combination of asymmetric and symmetric encryption that is used in order to conduct the transactions. Generally, you will see that the asymmetric key encryption is initially used to exchange the keys, the symmetric keys, and then we go ahead and use the symmetric encryption for all the transactions. So let's take an example of accessing a website, a browser client accessing a website. Now here I'm taking the example of IBM website. When you open up the IBM website on your browser, you'll see that there's a small lock here. If you click on that lock, you'll find that it says the connection is secure, and you'll find a certificate which is valid. Now, what essentially is happening here, if you click on the certificate, you'll be able to open up this page or this pop-up, which indicates that this certificate is certified by DigiCert, which is a global certificate authority. And this public key is specifically related to IBM, and the public key information is also available. You can see the algorithm RSA encryption here. Now, essentially, this certificate is nothing but the public key that IBM.com server is sharing. Now, with this public key, the browser client is able to then understand that since this is IBM.com and it is certified by the global authority, I can take this public key, I can encrypt my symmetric key using this public key and share it with IBM.com. Now, that symmetric key can only be read by IBM.com server. So once the IBM.com receives the symmetric key, it decrypts it, And then it can use this symmetric key with the specific client browser in order to conduct the next set of transactions. Hence, now we are able to secure our transactions between IBM.com and the client browser. Now, if at a later point of time, the browser wants to reconnect to IBM server, they again need to initiate this initial transaction, exchange the symmetric key, and then conduct the next set of transactions. So this is what the symmetric key or the session key is. Any questions so far? All right. In that case, we'll move on. Now, if we look at the cryptography today, as I mentioned, asymmetric key is used for the key distribution, where we have the public key and the private key. The public key is available with everyone. Private key is what we store with ourselves. If Alice needs to decrypt a message, again, Alice would herself need to share a public key with others and retain a private key with herself. The traffic is generally encrypted. The initial traffic is sent, the initial symmetric key is sent after using the asymmetric encryption, but the later transactions happen using the symmetric keys. Okay. Now, we use this in everyday applications, whether it is messaging, you talk about WhatsApp, the end-to-end encryption that you talk about there, the web traffic that is sent, any exchange that we do with the servers, the websites, emails that we use, the virtual private networks, that is the cloud hosted environments, everything uses this encryption. Now, the public key algorithms like RSA or Diffie-Hellman or ECC, all these use complex mathematical problems, which are integer factorization, discrete logarithm, and elliptic curve discrete logarithm. Now, these are very complicated mathematical problems which cannot be easily solved using classical computers. It will really take years to solve these problems. But in 1994, Peter Shor came out with a quantum algorithm, and he challenged the notion that the integer factorization cannot be done easily. And that is where it garnered a lot of interest in the quantum computing world, where a real algorithm, a quantum algorithm, could break things, break algorithms which were initially thought to be intractable. Now, that started the crypto clock countdown to a state where the quantum computers would be able to crack the existing algorithms, the crypto algorithms that are used to protect the data. And at one point of time, we could have quantum computers which can really have the sufficient number of qubits, and they could compromise any secret communication or any stored encrypted data, which is going to be which is quite valuable to protect. So let's take a look at today's crypto algorithms. Now, there is quite a bit of research currently being done in this area, basically started because of the Shor's algorithm. But if you look at the different research that is being done, in 2019, a research was done which indicated that a research paper was published in arXiv.org, and I've shared the links here as well. In 2019, it was shown that it requires at least 20 million qubits in order to break an RSA, break a RSA 2048 encryption. However, in just 2 years, there was another paper that was published which indicated that only 13,500 qubits are required in order to break this encryption. So you can see that the research is really advancing a lot. There's a lot of interest, a lot of work is being done in this area. Now, something that I do want to highlight here, these numbers should be taken with caution. We have to take into account the noise that comes in with the hardware, the specific hardware architecture that is being used in the quantum setup, the memory required, coherence, all these need to be taken into consideration when we think about the numbers that I have listed here. Now, the algorithms that we generally use for encryption and or for protecting our data, we use asymmetric, symmetric, and hashing algorithms. Now, if we start looking at the threat of quantum computers to these algorithms with the today's best practice as against the today's best practice algorithms, so asymmetric keys or the asymmetric algorithms, all RSA, ECDSA, ECDH, THE, all are quite really the recommended ones today. But if we take quantum computer in perspective, now, although they are not really a threat today, but in the future, quantum would be a threat to these because of the algorithms that are currently known. Symmetric keys, DES is not recommended even today, but AES is quite often used and is a recommended one. And if we take a look at the threat from quantum computer, it is really not that great, even with the quantum algorithms known today. We do have Grover's algorithm that can speed up the brute force, but if we double up the encryption level of AES, that would keep it good enough for using even with quantum computers in place. So symmetric algorithms, we don't really have to be a bit concerned right now. If we look at the hashing algorithms, SHA-256, SHA-3, they both are considered best practice today, and they're also quantum safe, so we don't have to be really concerned. So the only area that is of concern right now, because of the known quantum algorithms, is the asymmetric key encryption, and that is where you will see that a lot of efforts are being put in today. Now, which data really needs to be considered from asymmetric encryption point of view, or from the quantum threat point of view? Now, any data that is transmitted or stored, whether it is personal data, it is related to your work, it is medical data, tax data, any data that is there, that exists on cloud, that needs to be kept safe. So it would be any data that is not there on your cloud applications, even if there is data that you're storing in your backup, no longer used. If you're storing it in your backup, you again have to encrypt it and store it for the lifetime of the data, and you have to ensure that that data is secure till the time till its lifespan, and hence none of the future technologies as well should be able to break that data during its lifespan. Whether you're talking about the IoT devices that are connected, or even if the enterprise the applications that companies have, all that data needs to be protected from any eavesdropper. So what is the quantum risk timeline? And I've taken this snapshot from the Quantum Risk Timeline report that is published by Quantum Risk Institute. I've shared the links in my references section as well, where you can go and reference it. But the quantum risk timeline is really the time within which we need the applications and the organizations to migrate those applications to a more quantum safe algorithms. Excuse me, I need to switch off my alarm, please. Sorry. Sorry about that. Okay, so we need to protect that data that is there in the applications, handled by the applications. Hence, it is important that we are able to adopt algorithms, encryption algorithms that are going to protect that data even from the quantum computers or threats from the quantum computers at a later time. So it would take a lot of time for us to migrate those applications to a quantum safe crypto algorithms. And then this data would also have some shelf time. So if we take examples of, say, tax records, they are generally required to be kept maintained for 6 to 10 years, depending upon the different countries' regulations. If you talk about medical records, they would be required to be kept for at least 6 years after the last discussion or usage for that particular patient. If we talk about, say, the medical trials, that would be required to be kept for around 25 years or more, depending upon the kind of issue that is. If you talk about the trade secrets, that could range from 20 years to 100 years, depending upon the value that trade secret has for a particular company. So keeping that in mind, the companies need to understand what data they are trying to protect and for how long that data needs to be protected. Based on that, the companies need to put together a strategy such that they are able to plan for the future encryptions and encrypt the data, migrate to that encryption levels, and protect the data for the future. The threat timeline here really is the time before a quantum computer of enough qubits, enough power would be available that can actually break the encryption. So there are different factors that really influence this risk timeline. There is no guarantee that it will happen in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. No one can say that right now because there's a lot of research being done. If we take a look at the different factors involved, the first is the asymmetric key encryption is itself, the strength of that. We know that there is an algorithm that can break it. We know that the quantum computers are not available to break the encryption yet, but the algorithms are available. So depending upon how the work progresses in terms of defining new algorithms that can really be used instead of the current ones, which are easily breakable, and how research progresses in the quantum side as well to define more algorithms, we could have challenges here. We know of two algorithms right now from the two quantum algorithms right now, which are a threat to the current encryptions. One is the Shor's algorithm. Shor's algorithm is really posing a threat to the asymmetric encryption algorithms. Grover's algorithm is providing quadratic speed to the unstructured search, so it could be used for brute force. But then if we double up the encryption for the symmetric algorithms, we can anyways keep it protected, but it is not such a big challenge right now. Depending upon how the research goes and how many such algorithms, newer algorithms are identified in the future, there will be a change in the threat space, and hence that will influence the risk timeline as well. The security time value of data is quite important, whether it is 10 years, 20 years, 100 years. It really depends upon the data we are trying to protect, and hence it is very important for the organizations to understand what are they really trying to protect, for how long they need to protect it, and whether the encryption being used to protect the data is going to be sufficiently good enough for the future lifespan of that data. And then crypto agility is nothing but the ability of the organizations to move to a more secure algorithm. And it is interesting that NIST has published a white paper where they have provided their analysis that once a standard is published, any new standard is published, generally it takes an organization 5 to 20 years to adopt the new standard. So that itself is a big challenge, because if we think about it, all the quantum computers, we cannot say that it will be there in 5 years, 20 years. But looking at the amount of work being done and looking at the amount of groups that are coming, or vendors or organizations that are coming up with their own architectures and the work that they are able to do in terms of enhancing the number of physical qubits, it may be a possibility that in the near future, 5-10 years, we do have quantum computers that are of good enough strength. Now, if we take this 5 to 15 years time that is generally required for companies to adopt the newer standards, that does pose a challenge. And hence, it is important that these organizations start planning now on what data they have, for how long they need to protect, and how they are going to migrate to the newer standard once that new standard is published. So before we start taking a look at what are the new standards that are being, or what is the work being done on that front, let's try to understand the difference between quantum cryptography and post-quantum cryptography. So these terms generally are very easily confused, and hence I thought it will be a good idea to put a distinction here. Now, quantum key distribution, or quantum cryptography is basically distributing the symmetric keys using the actual physical quantum layer. So you would use the photons to actually encrypt the symmetric keys and distribute it. And this will be done using the quantum infrastructure. It has to be special infrastructure that is designed for teleporting the quantum states. Now, this is definitely going to be secure against the quantum attackers, but the special infrastructure that will be required is like optical fibers or satellites. Optical fibers, although they are everywhere, that is not a challenge. The challenge really is in terms of how, what kind of signal can be transmitted over the optical fibers, and for to what distance that signal can be transmitted. So if we take a case of optical fibers, probably after 100 kilometers, the signal will be quite weak to teleport any quantum state. And hence that poses a range limitation when it comes to optical fibers. We can go for satellites, but the satellite has a challenge of bit rate that can be transmitted. So you can think about kilobits, or it could be 100 plus kilobits, whatever. The bit rate is quite kilobytes. So bit rate is quite low there, and hence if we want to transfer a bulk of information, that is going to be a challenge in case of satellites. So with this, we need to think about cryptography that can be used with the current infrastructure, which does not have any of these limitations. So we can think of classical algorithms. Now, classical algorithms also can be used right now, as we have seen for symmetric encryption. We are anyways using it. We need to come out with newer algorithms which are classical, which can be run on classical computers as well, on the classical infrastructure as well, to solve our challenge, and that is what is post-quantum cryptography or quantum-safe cryptography. So here we are not using any quantum physical layer for encryption. It is classical mathematical problems. It will be safe against the quantum attackers, and it can be implemented on today's infrastructure itself. So what we should expect as part of that is an update to TLS or OpenSSL protocols itself, where they will be able to adopt the newer standards. And this would not have any limitations on the range of transmission or bitrate limitation as well. So considering the threat that is posed to the asymmetric algorithms, NIST, that is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they initiated the process to standardize the asymmetric algorithms, and they solicited the papers for the submissions for newer algorithms that could be used to address this challenge. In 2017, the papers were submitted, and there have been 3 rounds already of reviewing those submissions. And as you can see now, after the 3rd round, we have 7 finalists. IBM has 3 algorithms here in the finalists, and we have a couple of IBMers as well who have their in the finalist and the backup list of algorithms. Based on these final algorithms, standard is going to be published, which is expected to come out in 2023. The backup list that you see here is also something that may be used in the standard or as backup algorithms post further review. Now, if we look at the different candidate algorithms that really came up for this submission, there are different approaches being taken by the participants in addressing this challenge. And these are all classical algorithms, and quite a few have been there from 1970s as well. One of them is the multivariate equations, where you're looking at having multiple equations, something like a quadratic equation, which can be used to generate the schema, and public-private key can be generated out of it. It is hard to solve even using the quantum computers right now, and that can be used for the asymmetric encryption. The code-based is really the code correction algorithms that are code error correction algorithms, which are there from 1970s. These can be used to for the encryption as well. The hash-based are the hashing algorithms, and these can be used for the digital signatures. Then there are Zipper, Singular, Isogeny, and many others that are many other approaches. Of course, the largest being the lattice-based. The lattice-based is where multi-dimensional lattices are used for generating the schema, and this is where you can see IBM also has its focus. All the 3 algorithms that are there in the finalists that IBM has are lattice-based. So now with that, we'll start taking a look at Shor's algorithm. But before we do that, I wanted to quickly check if there are any questions that anyone would like me to address.
Can you share some more insights on lattice-based techniques? Possible?
I haven't gone through the details of those, but essentially to give you an understanding, if I have say 100 numbers and I have 5 sets of those 100 numbers that I give. Out of that, I sample a few numbers which is used to generate the public key. It is going to be challenging, more difficult for classical computers as well as any quantum computer to detect those and determine those. And that is where the lattice algorithms come in. To what I understand, they are using multi-dimensional, so it is not just 1 or 2 lattices, it is many, many more lattices, which makes it more complicated. I hope this gives you some perspective, but I have not really done much work on the lattice side.
No issues. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to Shor's algorithm. So the problem statement really here was the asymmetric keys like the RSA. They use primarily 2 numbers to generate the public key and the private key. Now, out of these two numbers, one number is really a multiplication. It's a semi-prime number. It is a multiplication of 2 very large prime numbers, which makes it very difficult for classical computers to factorize. Now, for this, generally the classical computers take super polynomial time, because of which these algorithms were really considered intractable. Now, in 1994, Shor came out with a quantum algorithm, and he showed that these prime numbers or the semi-prime number could be factored using the period finding problem. And it could be done in polynomial time, which really gave a speed up to the factorization challenge. And that is where it became very interesting in the quantum world to try and implement that algorithm and factorize the numbers. Quite a bit of work was done by multiple vendors. IBM was the first company to work with Stanford and show it in practice that this can be implemented. This was done in 2001, and after that, many other companies have also tried implementing the same. Now, if we take a look at Shor's algorithm, it is essentially the implementation of quantum Fourier transform and quantum phase estimation algorithms. The function that we use for Shor's algorithm is a raised to x mod n, where a and n are positive numbers, a is less than n, and they have no common factors. Now, if we plot this graph, this function on a chart, we will see that there is some kind of periodicity that comes in. So this is the period that is determined, which is r is equal to 12. This is the period that is determined for the numbers 3 and 35. The a is 3 and n is 35. And this is what helps in determining the factors. And we'll take a look at it in some while, but this is how the factors are determined. Now, this is very simple for the numbers that we have taken here, but in practicality, there could be charts or there could be graphs that are quite complicated and difficult to determine the periodicity by naked eye. And hence, these algorithms really come useful. This algorithm really comes useful, especially in case of higher numbers. Now, there could be cases where the graph itself, what we are doing is looking at a very isolated place because of which we are not able to really come out with periodicity. Or it could be that we are quite zoomed in some cases because of which a periodicity is not determined, and hence these algorithms would come in handy there as well. So let's take a look at the different steps involved in implementing Shor's algorithm. So the first step is really that we pick a number a such that it is co-prime with n, where n is a multiplication of two prime numbers, p and q. Now we need to check that, of course, the a and n are prime, they are co-prime, and hence we'll just determine the GCD, the greatest common divisor, and it should be 1, nothing else. Now, once we identify that, we need to identify the order of the function a raised to r mod n, such that a raised to r is equal to n modulo n. The next step would be to see if r is even. If we determine that r is even, it's good. We can proceed to the next steps. Then we determine the value of x. X would be a raised to r by 2 modulo n. And if x plus 1 is not equal to 0 modulo n, then we can determine our p and q using the greatest common divisor as listed here. If at all r is odd, then we need to find another a and proceed with the entire calculation again. Now let's take an example of n equal to 5 by 3, where 5 and 3 are the two prime numbers, and n becomes our semi-prime number. So step one was to determine what a we want to take. We want to identify a such that it is co-prime. So here we have taken an example where a is 13, it is co-prime with 15, so we are good here. The step 2 is to take to find the order r. Now, if we look at a modulo n here, a raised to the power r modulo n here, for 13 raised to 0, we'll get a value of 1. 13 raised to 1 will get 13. 13 raised to 2 will get with modulo with mod 15 will get 4 as the remainder, and so on and so forth. When we start writing these CDs, we see that there is a periodicity that is coming here, and the periodicity really is 4 here. The next step is to check if r is even. Now we have determined r is even, so we determine the value of x. The value of x comes out to be 4 with modulo 15. Now, if x plus 1, that is 4 plus 1, is not equal to 0, so we are good here. We can determine the values of p and q. So we do a greatest common divisor of 4 plus 1 with 15 and greatest common divisor of 4 minus 1 with 15, and we get the values of 5 and 3. So we are able to determine the prime numbers using this algorithm. So essentially, if you look at it, this step 1 is essentially a classical problem. This does not require any quantum algorithm to be executed. Step 2 is where we are actually doing the executing the algorithm, the quantum algorithm, to determine the periodicity. And once we have that information, we are using again a classical algorithm or classical calculations to determine the prime numbers. So generally, it's very easy for you to see that it's not that everything has to be done by quantum computers. It's a combination of classical computers and quantum computers that will help you to solve the problems. Now, what is really QFT and QPE? I wouldn't be going into much of detail here, but just to give you a context, and this really helped me get very basic clarity of what is QFT really doing, and hence I thought it might be a good idea to share this with you. So if you think about the 0 and 1 states, 0 and 1 states are really the North Pole and the South Pole on a Bloch sphere. What QFT essentially does is translates this into the equatorial basis. So you would now have the plus state and the minus state as the Fourier basis. And essentially, that is what quantum Fourier transform is doing. In basic terms, if you take a single qubit, you can think of the Hadamard gate, which transforms the 0 state to the plus state, or the 1 state to the minus state. To give you a quick look at it, probably what you could do is take a look at the quantum Fourier transform section of the Qiskit textbook, and you will be able to see that the 4-qubit number here from 0 to 15, it can be represented as zeros and ones when they are in the 0 and 1 state. But when we transform them in the Fourier state, you can see that this is now on the equatorial basis. This is around the z-axis, the rotations are done. and that is how the values are determined. And the inverse quantum Fourier transform would be just to change it from the Fourier basis to the computational basis, and we can then measure the results. So going back to our presentation, the next is the quantum phase estimation. Now, quantum phase estimation algorithm is also there in the Qiskit textbook, and I would definitely recommend you to go through that as well. We can take a look at here. This is the same image that I put in my presentation as well. But essentially, as part of the quantum phase estimation, we have the counting registers, which are put into the excited state, superposition state. And then we use the controlled unitary operations on the predetermined state, which does a phase kickback on these counting registers, which changes, which puts the phase into the counting registers itself. So now we have a state at checkpoint number 2, where we have the quantum phase embedded into our counting registers. We perform the inverse QFT to put that into the computational basis, and then we do the measurement to determine the 2 raised to the power t theta. This is how we retrieve the phase from this particular circuit. And that is what is used in Shor's algorithm as well in order to determine the periodicity. Okay, so with that, we are ready to get started with the lab part. Before we start with the lab, are there any questions that we want to take up?
So,
I'm sorry.
participants, feel free to ask any questions if you have regarding the session. So, ma'am, I have a small doubt. Can you please brief about the super polynomial time which you mentioned while starting the Shor's algorithm?
Okay, so I don't have the formula handy, but essentially when we solve the problem using classical computers, you'll see that the formula, the time required would be an exponential of the n to the power 1 by 3 log and log of n. So it's a very complicated formula that will determine the amount of time required to solve the problem. But when we talk about the quantum algorithm, we're actually solving it in the non-exponential time. So that polynomial, it will be just a polynomial, not an exponential, and that is what saves a lot of time in terms of quantum algorithm. If you want to go into the actual mathematical calculation, that will involve a lot of time, but I would definitely recommend you to go through, I'll probably share the links where you can go through the mathematical calculations there itself.
Thank you, ma'am.
Rather, what I could do is quickly, a very easy reference here would be to just go to the Shor's algorithm Wikipedia, and you can see the formula there itself. That will be much easier. So this is the time that is required. You can see this exponential number. This is the time required for a classical computer to solve the problem, while this is the time required by Shor's algorithm using the gates.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So moving on to the hands-on part, does anyone here have experience using the IBM Quantum Lab?
Punsha, we had previous sessions where we showed the demo of using how to use IBM Quantum.
All right. So then I would request everyone to go open up the IBM Quantum Lab. I have shared the Jupyter notebook that we'll be using with this for the session. Apart from that, at a later point, you can also take a look at the Shor Jupyter notebook that is provided from the Qiskit itself. I've given the location here, but for today's session, we'll just talk about the Jupyter notebook that I have shared. I believe the Jupyter notebook has been shared on the Discord channel, so you should be able to download it from there. Please let me know when you have that open.
You can download it from the Discord server. It is already uploaded in our Discord. Gulsha, can you increase the size a little bit?
Sure. This is better?
Yeah, fine.
Okay. So someone would, can someone give me an indication when I should get started, if you're ready?
I think we can start, Gulsha. It's
Okay.
fine. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so essentially what we're going to try and do over here is look at one implementation of Shor's algorithm. I have provided the code here. This is slightly different from what is provided in the Shor Jupyter Notebook provided by Qiskit. It is entirely taken from there, but I have made slight modifications at my end just to make it simpler for my discussion. So first we have to do the imports. I believe you might already be aware of these imports, so I'll not go into the details. So you can start executing these imports and the definitions as well. For now, I would request you to assume that this is a black box. This is a definition of modulo 15. It is specifically for modulo 15, and hence if you want to change the numbers, that is take another number of n, you will need to define another function which would be able to cater to that modulo. But for the purposes of this discussion, just assume that this is a black box. The definition is already in place and you don't have to write this definition yourself. QFT dagger is the inverse QFT. Again, the circuit, you can just assume for the purposes of our discussion that this is a black box for you, because we're not really going to focus on the QFT implementation here. So you can just run this definition as well. Now, this is where we start with the Shor's algorithm. So our first step was to determine the values of n. So here we have determined the value of n as 15. The n count is basically the number of counting registers. Now, generally, it is expected that you have 2 times n, the number of counting registers. So if we are talking about 15 here, we should be really having the registers, counting registers as 8. But you can see that the Jupyter Notebook that I've shared has the number 4. Now, for this specific problem, I can solve it using 4 counting registers, because that is how I know my output comes out to be. But if we start taking examples of higher numbers, higher prime numbers, you will realize that you will need at least, you will need to have 2n number of counting registers. So if we put that in perspective of RSA algorithm, if we want to implement the Shor's algorithm for 1048 or 1024 or 4028 2048 bits of encryption, you would need double the number of registers, which really becomes a challenge in implementing or cracking the RSA encryption at this point with the quantum computers that we have right now. But in the future, if the quantum computers do come up with the enough strength, enough power, and enough physical qubits which are sustainable, this will definitely pose a challenge. Now, the value of A that we want in order to have a repeatable execution, we have just taken a seed value here. But otherwise, you can have a random number generated, and then you can execute the rest of the code. Now, in this case, since I wanted a value of 13, and I know that I can get that value by entering a seed value of 12, I have entered here 12, and which helps me to get the Sorry, I did not run this, I think. Okay, so I get a value of 13 here. But if I change the value to 1, you can see that you will also get a value of A as 7, which can again be used for executing the Shor's algorithm. So you can definitely try and play around with this for the purposes of a discussion. And in order to continue with the example that we discussed in the presentation, I'll proceed with A equal to 13 here. Now, the second step we had was to determine whether these are co-prime numbers, and we have determined that by looking at the greatest common divisor, which comes out to be 1. Now, this is the function where we are implementing the quantum phase estimation. Okay, so the input value that we provide here is A, and we are defining the circuit, which is 4. These 4 are really the auxiliary bits, but we have the in count is the counting register. The first step that we performed, and if I can go back to my lab, the first step is really to put the quantum registers in the superposition state. So that is what we have done over here, where we have applied the Hadamard gate on the counting registers. Now, the next step is to put the auxiliary bit into the superposition, into the excited state, and that is what we have done over here. And then we apply the controlled U operations on the predetermined phase that was shared. So that is what we have implemented here, if you see. And then after that operation is done, we apply the QFT dagger, which you can see here. Okay, this will create a circuit that we need to determine our phase. The measurement can be done, and we have drawn our circuit diagram. So we'll execute the circuit later and see how our circuit diagram comes out to be. Now, we could use Air Simulator in order to run this circuit for now, but I also have another section here where we can use the QASM simulator. This is commented out right now, but if you would like, you can just comment out the Air Simulator section and run the QASM simulator section. Now, once the readings are retrieved, we plot the histogram, and we will take a look at the values that come out and how the register reading is then taken into consideration. This is the function we'll be calling in the next section of our program. Now, this is the program that we'll be running in order to execute our algorithm. So let me first run the function. Okay, now we come to the actual execution. So first, we have just set the flag factor found is false and the number of attempts, because we are really running this in loop and doing the attempts till the time we don't determine the factors. Now, once we start looking at the factors themselves, so the attempt 1 would be to first find the phase. And if that phase is not suitable, then is not right, then we do the next attempt. In the phase estimation, we are really calling the QPE AMOR 15 definition that we had mentioned here. And this will help us to determine the phase, which is a value of S by R. R here is the periodicity, and that is what we would be interested in finding. So let's take a look at so once the phase is retrieved, we determine the fraction using the fraction function, in which determines the value of S by R, and the denominator then becomes our lowest, smallest R that can be used for determining the prime numbers. Now, this is guesses because we are really guessing if this particular value of R is going to result into a prime number that is suitable for our purposes. If it is not really matching our requirement, then we'll have to go for the next attempt. So this is really a guess that we do. And if we determine that the guess is appropriate, this is what we are looking for, then the function stops execution. Okay, so let's run this program once. Now, you'll see here, this is how our circuit diagram is. We are performing controlled operations, unitary operations on the predetermined phase. And after all the operations are done, we are taking this, because of the phase kickback, all this phase gets into the counting registers. And from the counting registers, we are then determining the phase. The histogram plot that you can see over here, it gives us the probabilities of the different counting values in the counting register. And then we have also printed that value here. So you can see that for these values, the phases that are determined are listed over here. And then we just take one of the register values, and since the corresponding phase of all the zeros is 0, we then determine the result R. R becomes 1 here. But R equal to 1 will really not give us a good result, and hence we are then going for the next attempt where we again run the circuit. And this time we see the next value that we take in the register reading is this one over here. And with that, we get a phase of 0.25. With a phase of 0.25, we get the R value as 1/4. Now, if we do R plus 1, if we apply this to the X and determine X plus 1 and GCD with N, we will see that we are able to get the two numbers 5 and 3. So X plus 1 and N, GCD of that, and X minus 1 and GCD of that. Once we determine that the values are 3 and 5, we know that this is what our prime factors are. We can multiply to determine that these are indeed the right numbers, and hence we have determined the prime factors using Shor's algorithm. Any questions so far? Okay, now the next section, I've essentially provided you how the same thing can be done on the actual quantum computers, although we will not be able to run it because generally we have the quantum backends only with 5 qubits available for us. But this is how you can run the code in order to determine which is the least busy one. You could also remove the simulator filter from this piece of code in order to get the simulator backend on IBM Q and run the program there. So this is just for information. You can play around with this and see what you get. So if I just run this. So here you see the least busy backend is the IBM Q QASM simulator. But if I remove my, put back my, put back my filter here, and I execute this, you'll see that it is not the simulator that is being given. So this is still executing. It's just saying that my account is already loaded. So now I get IBM Q Santiago. So this piece you could just replace into the QPE function that we have over here. Instead of simulators over here, you can use that as the backend for executing your program. Okay, now Shor class is already implemented in Qiskit, and I wanted to quickly show you that as well. Probably that is something that you can use during your hackathon if at all you have some ideas where you need to use Shor's algorithm. So in order to do that, you would first have to import the Shor class itself. So that is what we have done, and we are taking the quantum instance. You can just quickly run that. And then we will use the QASM simulator as the backend. Instantiate the quantum instance, and then run the Shor's algorithm. But if you can see, there is some warning. I'm not getting it again because I've already run it once, but there is a warning that indicates that the Aqua packages are deprecated. Okay, so we'll address that. But if we go by this, we can still see that I'm able to run my Shor's algorithm. You can run this with Shor's algorithm. Do show.run, and you'll get the results. So here again, I've taken NS13 and NS15 and AS13, and you should see the results as 3 and 5 over here. So that we have got successfully, so which is good. You can play around with this, change the numbers, take AS7, run it again, and you should still be able to see the results. Okay, so we again got the result as 3 and 5. Now, in order to address the issue that we saw, the Aqua library is now deprecated. We should now move on to the next, the newer version of the library. So let's take a look at the Qiskit documentation. Here we can see that Aqua and Ignis are both deprecated, and the algorithm has been shifted to Qiskit-Terra. So here we have Qiskit-Terra algorithms, and if we search for Shore, we see that there is a factorizer algorithm here. So with that, then we would go back to our Jupyter notebook. So instead of calling from Qiskit Aqua algorithms, we will just call from Qiskit algorithms, and this should work fine. Checking to see that, no errors, so we are good here. Now, if we look at the Shore's algorithm, the Shore function here, it is really expecting only the quantum instance. It is not expecting the remaining of the parameters that I have over here. So probably I will need to modify my function call here and just have the quantum instance given. So I'll quickly do that and run my circuit. That runs fine, so we are good. But now the next step is really to run my Shore's function. So if I go here, how do I provide my N and A value? So there are 3 methods given over here. The construct circuit, we are not interested in that. Mod N, we are not interested, but factor is the actual execution of the algorithm, so we'll just go there. In the factor method, I can see that I have to provide the values of N and A. This is what I'm interested in. So let me then do my Shore equal to, my Shore dot factor, and then I provide my N equal to 15, my A equal to 13, and I should be good. Now, if I see this function, it will return a result type of Shore result. So let me just capture the result as well. Okay. So now I have run my factor, that is, I've executed my Shore algorithm, and I'm capturing the result in Shore result. I'll just wait for this execution to complete. Okay, so now that this is executed, I would now like to print my result and see. If I see my Shore result, it is essentially, so this is my Shore result. It will return list, so we should be able to print it directly. So let's print it out here and see what it gives. So here we see that it has given the factors of 3 and 5, successful counts, total counts. It has provided that value. I could always change my number of A to 7 or any other coprime to execute again. Okay, and I execute the print, and I see that I again get the factors of 3 and 5. So with that, I come to the end of the lab as well. So do you have any questions in regards to the lab or the session?
I would like to especially thank you, Gunja, for sharing this lab sessions also. Thanks a lot actually for your time. And I request if you're having any doubts, please do ask. Vandana, are you having any doubts?
Seemed very insightful, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your knowledge with us. So I'm only getting started with cryptography. So as far as what you have explained, I have no doubts. So when I'm trying to implement, if I have any doubts, I'll definitely contact ma'am. And
Sure, sounds good.
so yes, ma'am. So if there are no more questions, then thank you so much, ma'am, for taking the effort and imparting your knowledge with us. And we really found the session useful. So those who have attended, attendees, if you have any queries or doubts regarding these events or the further events, you can contact us at any point of time using the mail IDs posted in Discord and Hype. We'll be always be available to support you and guide you throughout the event. So after leaving the session, you will receive a feedback form. So please free to fill it out so that we can improve for the further sessions. And you'll also receive a link to this recording in Discord or Hype by Monday. So thank you for connecting with us. Thank you, ma'am. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.